When the first responders arrived, nobody on that team was prepared for what was waiting on the other side of that door. The call had come in like dozens of others, a name, an address, a concern from someone who knew her. Nothing in the initial report suggested urgency. Nothing flagged this property as somewhere that required anything beyond a standard welfare check. She was private. She was quiet. She was the kind of woman whose home sat on its street without drawing a single second glance from anyone passing by. The kind of woman that stories like this one are not supposed to find. The door was open, not forced from the outside, not broken at the frame, simply open, standing wide in a way that could mean almost anything if you were inclined toward optimism, and something very specific if you were trained to read the difference. The officers who approached it paused. They noted it, and then they stepped through into something none of them had been expecting. What investigators encountered inside the home of Nancy Guthrie was not what the exterior of that life had ever suggested was possible. It wasn't violent. It didn't point immediately toward a single clear explanation that would make the next steps obvious. What it pointed toward was something quieter and, in some ways, harder to sit with, a portrait of a life that had been carrying something significant for a long time, in complete silence, behind a facade that had given absolutely nothing away. Homes don't lie the way people can. They accumulate. They hold the record of daily existence in objects and arrangements and the small, telling details of how a person actually moves through their days, not how they appear to move through them. And sometimes when you step through the right door at the right moment, what a home has been holding comes forward all at once. Every investigator in that space felt it. That particular stillness that isn't peace. The kind that arrives only after something peace could not survive. This was a house that had a story to tell, and it had been waiting, silently, for someone to finally come and listen. There are streets in every town where one house sits without announcing itself. Not neglected, not remarkable, just present, part of the visual rhythm of the neighborhood in a way so consistent that the eye moves past it without registering it as something worth stopping on. Nancy Guthrie's home was precisely that kind of place. To the people who lived nearby, who walked past it season after season, who may have offered the occasional nod or brief exchange across a fence, it was simply a fixture, familiar, unremarkable. The home of a woman who kept her life close and her curtains drawn in the way that certain private people have always done, not out of suspicion, but out of a genuine and long-established preference for the interior over the exposed. She was not a public figure. That distinction matters here because it shapes everything about how this story unfolded. Her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, has spent decades building one of the most trusted and recognized presences in American morning television. Savannah's life has been, by the nature of her work, considerably more visible. The daily broadcast, the high-profile interviews, the carefully offered personal glimpses that create the particular intimacy between an anchor and her audience. Nancy existed in the orbit of that visibility without ever being pulled into it. She appeared in Savannah's public story the way parents of public figures often do, warmly referenced, affectionately mentioned, present in the background as a symbol of the grounded foundation from which the visible person grew. She was not examined. She was not watched. She was simply, quietly there, and that quietness, it turned out, had been doing a great deal of work. The investigators who crossed into her home were not simply entering a physical space. They were crossing the boundary between the version of a life that had been presented to the world and the version that had actually been lived inside these walls. Those two versions, as they were about to discover, were not the same thing. They had not been the same thing for some time, and the gap between them, the distance between the composed exterior and what the interior had genuinely contained, was wider than anyone standing outside it had ever been given reason to suspect. According to reports, the initial assessment of the home's interior produced an almost immediate shift in the nature of the response. What had arrived as a welfare check, a precautionary visit driven by concern from someone in Nancy's circle, escalated in tone and scope within a short time of entry. The open door had been the first signal. What the first room offered became the second, and the second was not something that anyone present felt comfortable setting aside. Questions began forming before the full picture had taken shape, questions that would require time and patience, and considerably more effort to begin answering than anyone had anticipated. When the call first came in, to make sense of what investigators found, you first need to understand what the neighborhood knew, what the community around her had taken, in good faith, to be an accurate picture of who Nancy Guthrie was and how she moved through her days. Because the distance between that picture and what the home contained is itself part of the story. By every available account, her life was genuinely quiet. Not performed quietness, not the specific, exhausting effort of someone projecting calm over an interior in constant turbulence. The real kind, the deep kind that belongs to people who have made a genuine choice to build their existence around privacy, and who have lived inside that choice long enough that it has become simply who they are. She kept to herself the way certain people do, not as concealment, but as preference. She was courteous when courtesy was appropriate. She showed up when showing up was required. But she did not extend invitations into the deeper parts of her life, and for the most part, those deeper parts had been left alone. Her home, from the outside, reflected all of this, tended without being showy, orderly in the way that suggests someone who takes their environment seriously as a private matter, not as a social one. The garden, the exterior maintenance, the general appearance of the property, it all communicated, consistently, the presence of someone who managed their life with standards and with care. Nothing excessive, nothing neglected, just steady, reliable order that asked for nothing and received nothing back from the street it faced, inside. Before any of this began, the space carried the character of a life lived with deliberate intention, objects placed where they belonged, a physical environment organized around what actually mattered to the person inhabiting it, rather than arranged for the benefit of anyone observing. Family photographs, the evidence of specific routines and interests, the kind of accumulated domestic detail that gives a genuinely lived-in space its particular texture. People who had been inside prior to everything that followed described it with consistent language. Settled, calm, a space that felt genuinely like the person it belonged to. That settledness is exactly what made the shift so jarring. Because the home that investigators walked into through that open door was not entirely the home that those prior visitors had described. Something had moved. Something in the atmosphere of the space had changed, not dramatically, not in the way of a scene arranged for maximum legibility, but in the smaller, more telling way that trained observation catches and holds onto. The stillness was still there, but it had a different character now, heavier, the kind of stillness that exists not as rest, but as the residue of something that had, at some point, broken the rest apart. Investigators are taught to absorb a space before they begin working it, to let the room land on them before they start imposing their process onto it. This is not sentimentality, it is methodology. The impression a space creates before anything has been moved or documented frequently carries information that the subsequent stages of a search can inadvertently erase. You only get one first impression of an undisturbed scene, and the investigators who entered Nancy Guthrie's home understood what they were receiving in those initial moments. The first room told them something important, not the full story, never the full story at first, but enough to confirm that the open door had not been a coincidence, and that whatever had brought them here warranted everything that came next. According to reports, what the initial walkthrough surfaced were elements that didn't align with the life the space had previously appeared to contain, not the kind of inconsistency that points toward violence or sudden physical crisis. There was nothing present that suggested that kind of confrontation had occurred within these walls. The inconsistency was of a different, quieter variety, the kind that accumulates when a life has been under sustained, significant pressure and has begun to show that pressure in the places where containment has been most difficult, the places that the daily discipline of a managed life tends to overlook because they seem too small to matter until they're the only things that do. Things were present in that space that didn't belong to the ordinary picture of Nancy Guthrie's days. Things were absent that, given everything known about her routines and habits, should reasonably have been there. The combination of those two observations, the unexpected presence and the unexplained absence began to form an image, incomplete, the way early pictures always are, but clear enough to tell the investigators that the welfare check had been more than warranted, that whatever had been happening inside this home, in the period before they arrived, had left its mark on the space in ways that were no longer invisible. Questions have been raised about the precise nature of what was observed during this phase of the investigation, and no complete official inventory of what was found has been made publicly available. What has been confirmed, according to reports, is that the discovery was sufficient to escalate the response significantly, from a routine welfare visit into something that required additional resources, additional expertise, and considerably more time than anyone had originally allocated. The shift in the room was palpable. Everyone present felt it had happened quietly, but the speed of it was not quiet at all. When the initial pass produces enough to justify a deeper look, the pace of an investigation changes entirely. The urgency that drove the first entry gives way to something slower and more deliberate, the careful, methodical work of a comprehensive examination. More people arrive. Documentation expands. The space is no longer being quickly assessed. It is being read with the particular patience and attention that reading something important always requires. Every surface, every room, every detail, no matter how small, documented before anything else can disturb it. The deeper search of Nancy Guthrie's home produced findings that, according to reports, substantially expanded the investigators' understanding of what they were actually dealing with. Not through a single, dramatic revelation. That is rarely how these things work, and the investigations that produce the most accurate pictures tend to be the ones that resist the pull toward the dramatic in favor of the accumulation of ordinary detail. What emerged was a pattern, the kind that becomes visible only when you have enough individual pieces in front of you to see what they form collectively. A pattern of a life that had been under significant pressure. A pattern of routine disrupted by something that had, over time, become woven into the fabric of daily existence while remaining invisible from the outside. According to those familiar with the development of the investigation, the areas of the home that commanded the most sustained attention were the ones that spoke most directly to how Nancy Guthrie had actually been spending her days in the period that mattered, not the public-facing areas of the space, the private ones, the places where the management of daily life happens without an audience, and where the evidence of what that management actually required tends to be most honestly preserved. People who work welfare cases professionally have noted, in speaking generally about situations of this type, that the most significant findings are rarely the most visually striking ones. They are the quiet findings, the ones you have to train yourself to recognize because they don't announce themselves. The slightly disrupted pattern, the minor absence that only registers when you know what to expect, the small evidence of decisions made under conditions that the person making them was working hard to keep private, all of it pointing toward a situation that had been developing for longer than any external observation had managed to detect. What the deeper search revealed, according to available reports, was entirely consistent with that pattern. A person managing something real and substantial, entirely alone, with the same quiet discipline that had defined every other aspect of her visible life. A person for whom the maintenance of an ordinary appearance had become not just a preference, but a necessity, a structure that the difficulty she was carrying required her to preserve, day after day, regardless of what it cost. How long the management had been necessary, and what the full scope of what it required from her actually was, those questions became central to everything that followed. The home had surfaced them with unusual clarity. Answering them would require considerably more than the home alone could provide. And then came the detail that changed the shape of everything. In almost every investigation, there is a moment when the accumulated weight of smaller findings yields to something more specific. A single thing, a single discovery in a single location that doesn't simply add to the picture already forming, but reorders it entirely, making the shape of the whole situation suddenly and unmistakably clear in a way it hadn't been before. Not necessarily the most dramatic find, often not the one anyone anticipated, but the one that functions as a key unlocking the full meaning of everything the investigation had already gathered. For the investigation of Nancy Guthrie's home, that moment arrived during a focused examination of a particular area of the property. According to reports, what was found in this phase of the search was described by those involved, in careful and measured language, as deeply significant, something that fundamentally altered the investigative team's understanding of what Nancy Guthrie had been living with and living through in the period they were working to understand. The specific nature of the discovery, what it was, precisely where it was located within the home, and the full details of what it indicated, has not been made part of any publicly available accounting. Questions have been raised about whether and when this information will enter the public record, and no official conclusion has been reached regarding how it will ultimately be handled. What is known, based on available reports, is that the response to the discovery was immediate and significant, that it required consultation with people whose area of expertise was specifically relevant to what had been found, and that the understanding of Nancy Guthrie's situation shifted in the hours that followed, in ways that would prove impossible to unshift. The people closest to Nancy Guthrie were informed. According to reports, their response followed a pattern that is painfully familiar to anyone who has been in the position of learning something significant about someone they love after the fact, from investigators, in circumstances that removed any possibility of a gentler introduction to the information. There was shock, and then, alongside the shock, something harder to name, a recognition, the experience of something being named that, once named, illuminated other things they had noticed over time, things they hadn't known how to interpret, hadn't known warranted interpretation, and now suddenly understood in a completely different way. That is one of the most specific and painful emotional experiences a person can have. The retroactive clarity that comes when something is finally named, when the thing you didn't have language for acquires language, and the language changes not just the present but the past. It reaches backward. It makes you reconsider every interaction, every moment you were present and didn't see what was there to be seen. Every ordinary visit and easy phone call, an unremarkable goodbye that now holds a weight. It didn't hold at the time. The investigation had, by this point, moved beyond the question of what was inside the home. It had become, in the most important sense, a question about what had been inside the life, about why something this significant had remained completely invisible to the people who had been closest to it, for what was now beginning to appear to have been a considerable period of time. Evidence is honest in a way that living people often cannot afford to be. It documents, it records, it preserves the actual state of things, without the editorial intervention of someone working to manage how those things are perceived. A home that has been genuinely lived in carries a truth that the person who lived in it couldn't always control, the truth of the patterns, the routines, the specific shape of the daily choices that constitute an actual life rather than a presented one. What the evidence gathered from Nancy Guthrie's home established, according to reports, was a situation with history behind it, not something recent, not a crisis that had arrived abruptly from outside her life and disrupted something that had been functioning well, something that had been present for a long time and had been managed, persistently and in complete privacy, through the same composure that had characterized everything else. About how she moved through the world, the interior reality of her life had been diverging from its exterior appearance for a period that the investigation was still working to fully define. This particular kind of finding, the discovery of a sustained, hidden difficulty rather than